So please take your seats, that we can start with our third session, the last but one before then the final wrap-up. Please take your seats. We will dedicate this session to the issue of the future of human biomonitoring in Europe. The session will consist of a keynote which will dwell upon major elements of what we think or what the project thinks is needed in the future, in what formats that could happen. And it will be followed by a high-level discussion by a highly competent panel, and then by a discussion, or questions, answers, comments with the audience. And we have collected your questions. Thank you very much for your questions and comments. Some of those I think we will not deal with in this session, as the questions went obviously to the consortium. But we have collected them, we will put them on the website, and we will ask those members of the consortium who are in a position to answer it. So please, as you should anyhow, follow the website, look for your question if it is not being dealt with during the session, and we will see to get answers in due course. So that said, I want to invite Robert Barucki to give his presentation. I will do a short introduction on your person. Robert, you are professor of biochemistry at the University Paris Descartes and head of the INSERM unit toxicology, pharmacology and cellular signaling. The INSERM is the Institut National de la Santé et de la Recherche Médicale. You also had the metabolomics and proteomic biochemistry lab at the Necker and Enfants Malades Hospital. So, and you forgive me for, I'm an economist by education, so if I'm not so acquainted with the expert expressions, you forgive me for that. You study the impact of environmental contaminants on human health and their mode of action, and you're involved in EU programs on the exposure and mixture effects, as well as on effect biomarkers. So we are waiting for your presentation, and I would want the audience again to listen carefully, in particular on the actions that are being proposed, because we will do a little game on that after the presentation of Robert. Please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Josh, for this presentation, and thanks to the Austrian friends and colleagues for the wonderful organization of these, actually 5 days now, and maybe last session of the 5 days, but I hope you still have, for those who stayed over the 5 days, you still have some energy, and for those who are just came today or just yesterday, so have, listened to this, I think, important session where we will discuss some of the thinking that we have and some of the options that we have for how to have a sustainable human biomonitoring in the future. So I would like to say, to start with, that what I will be talking about is certainly not a final presentation on these issues. It's actually something we are currently working on, and this week is fantastic for us because that's where we can get your opinion, your suggestion, commentary, criticism on what is presented here so that we could improve it and have more developed proposals in the next few months or in few years. So I would like to start by, and most of my talk actually will be on what is needed, functionally needed, to have a reasonably good sustainable HBM in Europe. So we will talk about the different tasks and missions that we have within HBM and see how we could have them in a more sustainable way, and whether there is one, two, or more tools that are needed to get this into practice. So this first slide shows you that internal dose determination is in the middle. It's the middle of the real framework of exposure to health effect and studies. If we start on the left, you have the sources of exposure, then the media, and all this leads to an internal dose that you could assess through human biomonitoring. But then on the right, this dose goes to different tissues and then is likely to have some effect, and then this leads putatively to adverse outcomes. This means that it's quite central, and this has two consequences. First, it's when you are interested in exposure and health, it's really unavoidable to, at one point or another, to deal with internal dose determination and biomonitoring one way or another. That's first. But on the second point is that dealing only with the internal dose is really meaningless if you don't put it in the big picture of exposure and health. And this is all about what basically we have been doing in HBM for you that we would like to continue in the future. Having a focus, of course, on how to determine the internal dose, but also a larger vision to address some important political issues, such as where is this exposure coming from, and does it matter? Does it have a health effect? So this is what we'll try to show. So if you allow me, I'll just make maybe a simple presentation of our current program. It really starts with some policy needs, and you have heard about prioritization earlier. It starts also with some scientific analysis of scientific gaps. Then we have all the procedure that you have heard about to develop surveys that would allow us to have an assessment of the internal dose and have an assessment of the amount and type of chemicals that is in our blood, urine, or hair, whatever. However, this is not sufficient per se. We have developed a number of additional activities, either on the exposure side or on the data analysis and interpretation side, that help two implications. The first one, on the exposure side, for example, is to assess the exposure pathway, starting from the amount of compounds in our blood to try to assess what are the most likely exposure pathways. And this is a very important issue because that's where you can have action. Also on this side, it's try to develop new methodology that allow us not only to deal with the compounds that we have prioritized, but also to deal with putatively emerging compounds, sometimes unknown compounds. And this is, I think, is extremely important now. It's going to become extremely important for the future because this activity is not only on emerging substances, it's also on emerging technologies, and those technology may become actually the actual routine technology maybe in 10 years from now. On the data interpretation side, we have a number of activities that tend to link the exposure to health effects. These are different types. You've heard about them. Having, for example, we have AOPs. Now you shouldn't say toxicity mechanism or whatever. You have to say AOPs, adverse outcome pathways. This is used already in risk assessment. Very important. A very important, robust description of the different steps, starting from an initiating event to up to a health outcome. We are also work on effect markers. We actually dealt with this issue a bit earlier, how important those can be, and particularly actually in the mixture field. We have also activity, as I just said, on the mixture, and we have heard a wonderful story on the mixture just earlier, and we have listened and heard how much it is important for the mixture field to have really a robust human biomonitoring that could interact with them and synergize in their activity. Well, internal dose plus all those activities are really required to support the policy question on exposure and health, and also to improve the science, and both go side by side. I mean, it's not only, I mean, I think a good scientist, his best, I think, objective and his best hope is to have something that has an impact somewhere, one way or another. And I think a good politician would like to have the best science to support his decision. So the HBM4U concept from the beginning is an interaction between science and policy and developing an EU platform, and that's not so easy. You have heard about it mostly this morning and early this afternoon. It's not so easy to do, but this is something that we would like to do, and to have some supporting research activities to interpret those data. And when I talk about research, I'm really talking about research that has an impact, a direct impact on the activity and on the interpretation of the activity. I'm not talking about pure basic research here. We are really working. And what is important for sustainability is that we should not have a gap between whatever we're doing now, HBM4U, and the actual sustainable framework that we will develop in the future. Because as you will see, all these options are difficult and will take a lot of time and effort from all of us. So the risk is that there's a gap between the end of HBM4U and that, and so we should not leave that. We should find an intermediate program to fill such a gap. So it all starts actually with the vision that we may have on human biomonitoring in the 5 or 10 years from now. What should it be? What will it be? What we could dream about first. Well, I think we should all we'd all be happy to see if in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, these human biomonitoring data are actually used in a systematic way in regulatory processes related to exposure and risk assessment. It's not just used like that when it's really used in a systematic way. This is what we hope for, and that's what I think is extremely important. We also hope to have a human biomonitoring that uses the most up-to-date technology in the exposure and health sciences. I alluded to that a bit earlier. Science is moving, the approaches are moving. There are new ways to do analytical work. There are new ways to connect exposure to health issues. We heard about epigenetics earlier. We heard about omics. I mean, all these will get into this framework and should support us in having, I think, the best human biomonitoring and to be able to interpret these data. The other issue is that a sustainable and balanced framework of human biomonitoring requires both the EU level and the member state level, and we cannot insist more on that. This is extremely important, especially that we are in a field where we would deal with environment, we deal with chemicals, and we deal with health. And those are not dealt with at the EU level exactly the same way. Some are more member state levels, others are more EU levels. So we are in between, and we have to basically combine the efforts from the member states as well as the effort from the EU, and we need a commitment and an engagement of both. So this is a proposed timeline. I mean, I don't know how true this will become, but that's a proposed timeline. And as you see, HBM4U, with all the activities that are described here, will end by 2021. Then any sustainable framework will start somewhere, maybe after that. I don't know when. I mean, as I told you, all the options are relatively difficult. And as you see here, put another arrow in the middle because we think it's extremely critical that there's no gap between the two. And there are ways maybe to introduce maybe a more targeted project so that all the expertise, all the efforts that we have done, bringing together people from very different fields, I mean, people from agency, from research institute, people that are doing analyticals with people that are more into the talks or in the relation to policy making. This effort should not be lost, and it's important not to leave a gap. And then we will have the sustainable. And what I will be presenting now is some ideas about what such a sustainable framework could be for HBM. And to do that, it was important to isolate all the different activities that will be required for this sustainable framework, and then to see the tools, how we could fit in the tools, and this can be developed further later. So all the activity first, if you have a sustainable framework, you need certainly a central coordination. Somebody has to coordinate all this. I mean, you cannot leave it completely independent. And for example, the priority setting framework, as we have already developed in HBM4U, should be also among these coordination parts. And we also need to have somewhere to store the data and to try to exploit initially, at least initial exploitation of the data. We also need, as activity, to do the study design, the harmonization of study design, if there are different studies in different countries. We need, of course, network of laboratories for the harmonized analysis. And we need what I call here research activity, but as I told you, what we hope from currently what is described as research today, I hope it can become something more systematic in the near future. That's the aim of the research. So, and as I said, it's targeted research, for example, mixture studies, for example, new development in the analytical world, or new connections between exposure and health. So we also need some local organization in the different member states. We need to have field work, maybe laboratories at the local level, somebody to do the data collection, whatever it is, and also some maybe targeted study. There will not necessarily be only Europe-wide studies. There can be some more targeted study. For example, it's very critical to think in terms of occupational work. We have heard about the occupational aspect a little earlier, about hotspots. I mean, these also should be on our agenda. So what are the options to be explored? And this is certainly not a final list or a complete list. This is an idea that we are developing now. Of course, there are the national programs, not develop that, but those are extremely important for us because, as I said, member states are an important part of the framework. There are also EU institutions that could be involved in this framework. That could be, for example, institution anchor and a decision-making process, a coordination, for example. And IPChem is a good example of an EU institution that has a specific function on data storage and initial exploitation of the data and combining data from different origins. So this is a good example. Maybe we could use it in other boxes to fill, this framework. Horizon Europe offers currently a number of options. For example, Article 185. I don't think I'm going to go into detail. We don't have the time to go into detail on each one of those. Research infrastructure up to an ERIC, for example. A public-private partnership, as well as European, maybe the next generation European joint program. These are possibilities. Maybe with the new framework there will be other possibilities. Maybe some of those will not be there or differently, but we have to adapt. Actually, what we are doing now is to examine all the options, and then we will adapt to the development of this framework. We also are here to provide some of our needs, actually, to the Commission and to the member states so that they know what are the needs. There are other EU programs that could also be valuable in this framework, and I have listed a number of those here. But the most likely framework is that it will be a combination of some of these tools and maybe some of these other tools. And the whole trick is to find the right combination and a smooth combination. And that's the challenge that we have, and I hope we can do it. So now if I go back just to give you an example of the way we could see it, I mean, it's not purely in our minds, it's the way we could see it based on the activities that I have described just a minute ago. For example, the coordination would be an EU institution, and for data storage, of course, IPChem has been cited, and that could be an option. If you go back to the design of the studies, the laboratories, the research, the targeted research activities, then there could be a laboratory network and a research infrastructure. RI is a research infrastructure that as can be found in Horizon Europe, that those could fulfill this kind of activities. And what is in yellow is mostly member state level and in our minds, and could be fulfilled by some other structural funds or national programs that could fulfill those ideas. This is one suggestion, obviously nothing final, but this is the way we are working now and trying to find a framework that could fit our objectives. So what's the way forward? Well, first we have to convince everybody, decision maker at the member state level, at the EU level, of the importance and the need for this long sustainable HBM activity in Europe. I think there are many other people that have different ideas, but we have to convince the decision maker that this is important and this is quite relevant. We have to scale up part of our activities to maybe see where we could use HBM in a more systematic way. we have to describe all the different options and try to make different proposals and to develop a mandate, a group of experts within our consortium and outside to bring these ideas together and establish the framework and make more practical suggestions in the future. So with this, I would like to end, and I think this will be, help an introduction to what the debate will be, and I would like to thank you and remind you that HBM needs you. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this inspiring and comprehensive input to our panel discussion. I understand you focus on, say, two areas. One is being the activities, so the functionalities, as you mentioned it. What shall be delivered? What should be the performance of future the future human biomonitoring system? And the second is you gave us some say first thoughts on what could be structural elements to sustain this sustainability. So what could be a legal format, what could be the connected financial format, what could be the institutional framework, and I think this is very valuable. So my question to the audience is, please, if you're interested, grab again your smartphones and follow us in another small exercise, which is on these aspects of, or these 5 activities that have been mentioned in Robert Baruchi's presentation. Yes. And in your smartphones, when you're logged in, then you will find these 5 activities, or you should at least find these 5 activities. And here you can evaluate any one of them with regard to 2 aspects. One is how important, how big do you estimate the necessity that this activity should be followed? And the second aspect is, how do you think about, shall this activity be a very much joint effort activity, or is it up to stakeholders to just do their job? And you can evaluate that from 1 to 10, and we will give you a few minutes, not very much, 2 minutes time or 3 to see the outcome, and then I would ask you, Robert, to give a short comment of whether you think the responses from the audience are plausible, or what your impression is.
Thank you for making my life easy.
So 2 minutes to go. So, I think you need some more time? No. I think we have already almost 60 answers, and we present you the results. So, Robert, I think that do you want to come over and have a look at the results? Okay. Can you see it here?
I don't see it.
No, we don't see it here.
So, the interesting point here is that all 5 questions are in the upper right side of the figure. And of course, we do not have, well, first I have some comments. When you do HBM study, you usually try to work on representative populations, and I don't know how representative this population is. The second point, it's important to have some idea about the, the uncertainty about each answer. But on the other hand, I think most of them are actually grouped. When we do PCA analysis, this appears usually as a single group, and this would appear as a single group. Most of them are grouped, maybe targeted research activities, which is usually not completely understood because it's too vague as a general, and maybe we should have put a more specific. If I would have put, for example, assessing mixture activities, I think I would have seen it in the more upper and more right. I'm sure I would. But basically, I think most people think that it's necessary to do these activities in general, and that mostly think that it's a joint effort. So the majority, at least, now with some maybe small differences between the different activities. So all in all, I think it corresponds quite nicely to the presentations that we have. And even if, for example, laboratory networks appear here as a common activity, which is, I think it's an important part, they can also be developed in specific member states. So, I mean, it's to completely distinguish the two is maybe artificial to a certain extent, but I think it's very positive to see that most of us think that this, one way or another, should be a joint activity. I think this is a very promising result here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think you got the, you and your team got the activities right, because they're all in the upper right quadrant. So I would now ask my panelists to come to the stage, and I will give a short introduction to any one of you. First, Hans Breunings, who is the head of the European Environment Agency, Executive Director. You have a full record as a researcher. I will not go through it in detail.
Please
I think.
Don't.
With studies in the United States and at quite an astonishing number of places. And now you're heading one of the central knowledge hubs at EU level, even encompassing the EU member states with the European Environment Agency, and being an important partner for environment agencies all over the place. Second is Lilian Busse, head of the division Environmental Health and Protection of Ecosystems in the German Environment Agency, in our big sister institution in Germany. Wholeheartedly welcome. You're leading this division since 2015. Between 2006 and 2015, you were a lead scientist at the California Environmental Protection Agency, and also have an astonishing scientific background and record. Björn Hansen, who comes to us as the Executive Director of the European Chemicals Agency. Your CV shows that you have been working at different places and in different functions in the European Commission as head of unit for chemicals in DG Environment. And since
9 months.
9 months. I can't believe it.
Full pregnancy.
I can't believe it. 9 months.
Pregnancy.
You are Executive Director of the European Chemicals Agency, which, what I just learned today, is quite a huge expert institution. 600 staff is really impressive. So be very welcome. Next is Anne Paoletti. She is Scientific Director for Biology and Health, Ministry of Higher Education, Research and Innovation in France. Also, you went through a career not only in administration, but also in research, in particular at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in different positions. So it's good to have you here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Next is Katarina Šepková, who comes to us from the Czech Republic, and we just talked that you represent at least 90% today or this evening the Czech Republic. You have obviously a quite prominent international outreach, and maybe you will tell us a bit about this. You're director of the National Center for Toxic Compounds and Stockholm Convention Regional Center in the Czech Republic. Your institute is located in Brno, not very far from Vienna, just to the north, 200 kilometers, since 2012, which is located at the Faculty of Science in the Masaryk University there. Last but not least, Hans Verhagen, who comes to us from the third European agency, European Food Safety Authority. You're a senior scientific advisor there, and you have shall I mention it, 35 years of professional experience, but you also worked at another agency back in the Netherlands, at RIVM, which is also an important partner in the network of environment agencies, and at the TNO Nutrition and Food Research Institute, and now in EFSA. So be very welcome. I would like to come back to Mr. Baroukis, to Robert's presentation, and again remind you on these two, I think, important aspects that were in there. One is on these functionalities, and I would ask you to come back to that. What are really the activities that shall be performed by the future HBM? What are, from your point of view, possible either other segments or aspects or endorsing, say, the framing in a financial, in an institutional, in an organizational sense, in a legal sense that we have seen in this presentation? And maybe a bit more specific, what is the role of your institution in this framework? Maybe even what would you ask other institutions they should do? And not only what are your needs from the future HBM, but also what can be or should be or will be your contribution. So this said, I would like to ask you for a first round of, say, more statements of a more general sense, 5 minutes each, and then we will go on from there and also see how we involve the audience. First, where do I have it? First, I would like to ask the ladies for their interventions. Janne Busse, may I start with you? That you give us a short, say, 5 minutes presentation on where the German federal agency comes from and how you look at these aspects.
Is this, okay, so you can hear me. So thank you so much. I'm with the German Environment Agency, but I'm also speaking for the German Ministry of the Environment, who heavily supports us in this effort. As most of you know, we do the German Environmental Survey for many, many years, since the mid-'80s. So we have a lot of financial but also political support to undertake our studies, and we will continue those studies in the future. We are adding more and more substances to it and different contaminants. So what I see first is that we really need good national programs in the member states. We are trying to make ours sustainable in the future, and so this is one thing that I think it's important. We actually do our program because we really feel that it's important to evaluate the success of the regulations that are done on the national level. We also really want to inform the public about the exposure situation in Germany. And then lastly, we also really ambitious to identify the exposure pathways, and especially for vulnerable groups like children we heard a lot about today. So first of all, I think good national programs are important, but then we need a good framework on an EU level. We heard today that we really need good data quality, we need harmonized methods, we need good communication tools, we need to reach the decision makers on the EU level, and I think all of this can only be done when we do that together on an EU level. So I think we definitely need a sustainable framework that we can rely on, each of us in the member states, that we can rely on, that we reach the decision makers and the policy makers on the EU level. So maybe lastly, we all know that the chemical regulation is done on an EU level. So that means we cannot just do this on a national level. So we have to make sure that we follow all these hundreds and hundreds of chemicals. We can do that much better when we do that together with the member states. And so I think we can only be stronger together with the different member states. Thank you.
Lilian, may I ask you, Germany has or your agency has a really long-standing experience in HBM. You started with that when?
Mid-80s.
In the mid-80s?
Yes.
Already.
Yeah, so we have a representative study. We started in the mid-80s, and maybe I can add to that, we also have an environmental specimen bank where we also sample urine and blood for not representative groups of people, but students on a yearly basis.
And this seems to be unique in Europe, this infrastructure that you are hosting in Germany.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you very much. I would like to get a second, say, member state perspective. Anne Paoletti, may I ask you for your intervention?
Sure. Thank you very much. I would like first to thank Austria for hosting us today, and it's a very interesting meeting, and I'm really happy to be here and present France's perspective. So I would like to start by mentioning that in France, health and safety issues on chemicals have been set as long-term priorities in 2007 during what we call the Grenelle Conference for Environment. And since then, public awareness in France about these issues has remained very high and is reflected in public opinions by polls, for example. So on these issues, on these long-term priorities, I think they are really well reflected in the support that France is providing to this program, the Hbm for EU, by three of our ministries, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, and Ministry of Research, because we are three program owners in France for this program. And we do have a common vision from these three ministries for the program since the preparation work, which is that we need to improve knowledge and research on human exposure to chemicals to get better regulation and protection of European citizens. So this is reflected in the participation of France through both research organizations as well as health and environment regulatory agencies into the program. As you know, because we have INSERM participating as well as 7 other institutions. And by the fact also that France is leading the Pillar 3 dedicated to the research part of the program. So indeed, to us, one great value of the program as it is now is to combine these 3 pillars and to combine in a single consortium the production of data with the development of methods to interpret this data and to the translation into policy to reduce exposure, harmful exposure through evidence-based regulation of chemical use and exposure. So what is the future? What can and how can France contribute to the future and to the sustainability to the program? So we have a biomonitoring program in France, and this program is already contributing to the work because our Esteban study will be used as part of the fieldwork that is going to be performed, as you probably know. In addition to this, we have another part of our program, which is the cohort ELF of newborns and their mothers, and we think this is an asset that could be maybe used in the future to develop the program. But beyond these measurements of Hbm or Hbm measurements and epidemiologic studies, we think it is really necessary to develop the understanding of the causal relationships between exposure and adverse effects on health. And to do so, we need to investigate pathways, alterations leading to disease, identify through this work, effect biomarkers in particular, that can be used, for instance, for early detection of health adverse effects, and produce guidance values, etc. Another field where there are needs, methodological needs, probably technological development needs, as well as probably theoretical development needs, is the field of mixtures and emerging substances that was talked about a lot today. So we wish that France contributes to the future development of a sustainable program of human biomonitoring. And the way to do so is also to use our national program. So we are currently under renewal of our French National Plan for Health and Environment and of the strategy for endocrine disruptors. And as part of this, we are in the process of reinforcing the French biomonitoring program, and we have a strong wish to continue coupling research with biomonitoring. And in terms of sustainability, one of the actions that is proposed is to build an infrastructure dedicated to advanced analysis of chemical exposome in France. So we believe that these objectives are really well aligned with the program that we wish is developed at the European level. It's really sharing the same objectives. In addition to this, there is certainly a need to develop further research probably on more basic aspects as well. And this is going to be funded both at the European level and at the national level. And we think, so our national agency is going to contribute, of course. But I think I would like to end to quote one program that was recently funded by the Commission, which is called HERA. It's a CSA, which is going to produce a strategic agenda for health and environment research. And I think this is an extremely important point as well, and we should seek to find complementary actions between this strategic agenda, which will include actions at the European and at the national level, and the program, whatever the organization it takes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you, may I ask you, do you at the French Research Ministry already have maybe a more concrete vision on how to sustain HBM at European level or at this coordinated level?
So the difficulty is that we are just changing frameworks at the European level, as you know. We're going to be in FP9 in a couple of years from now, and we don't yet know what tools will be available to build on a new program. So if a tool a bit evolved as compared to the EGP is created by the Commission, is proposed by the Commission. It could possibly be something that is used either for a temporary period until we build something which is definitely sustainable. An alternative is definitely a research infrastructure, which could be one of the components. And I think what we're doing at the French level is a bit going in this direction. But I think there is lots of still some flexibility, and we need to take into account what is going to be proposed by the Commission.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really the first stage or first stages and kind of brainstorming on what elements could or should play a role. Thank you very much. Next is again a member state perspective that I would like to invite. Katarina Shevkova, may I ask you for your, say, first intervention?
Absolutely, yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm here representing Ministry of Environment of the Czech Republic, and I would like to share what Czech Republic thinks about the human biomonitoring and what are the activities or where we think they are paramount importance. Similarly to what has been said by France, the program owner in the Czech Republic of the human biomonitoring for the EU is the Ministry of Education, Youth and Sport. But inevitably, through the characteristics of the program, there is also a necessary involvement of the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Environment, because, of course, there are chemicals which are in the center of the activities, and there are different portfolios that are governed by different colleagues. And when we try to find a way how to organize our national hub so that it is the most functional and so that it is also fulfilling the needs that we have in terms of the human biomonitoring and information flow and also possible contribution from different stakeholders group, we have actually attached it to already existing interministerial group which comprises all stakeholders that we have, because that's something that is supporting not only internal national activities, but also is providing support when international action of the Czech Republic is needed. That means not only towards the implementation of multinational environmental agreements, be it already quoted Minamata Convention on Mercury or Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, where member states also have a role because they are parties to those conventions. So in order to be able to get the condensed support or to raise the capacities and information that is already available at national level by different stakeholders, we had to concentrate these as activities, and we have successfully succeeded to link the national panel, national hub, so that it is able to quickly outreach to both the people that are doing the work in the field, but also to regulators and being able to influence each other, vice versa. So in terms of ongoing Hbm activities that we have, I think there is also quite long history, and since our country is much smaller than our previous two lady speakers, there we didn't have a countrywide study. We had more, I would say, smaller activities that started in 1990s, because prior 1991, we actually didn't have a ministry that would take care of environment and effects, and actually we didn't have any law on chemicals until 1997, so it was a framework law, so that was something that was quite different. Nevertheless, there were already activities in the past that related to the health protection, and that was quite advanced at the time. What I would like to mention, and it is also quite important, is that yes, the Hbm, the human biomonitoring activities as they are currently now, are developing and trying to respond to the needs of the European Union, of the member states. But it's not only that we are EU and we do it for ourselves. We, I think, have to synergize with the outer world and see what is the best that we can take from outside and implement it so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are already tools which are developed for years by World Health Organization. There is a lot of work which has been done by global experts in expert groups in the Stockholm Convention, as it has been presented earlier today. There are also longitudinal studies that look at various chemicals. And I think that we are very grateful to see that some of these things are picked up also by the HBM project, be it, for example, certain priority chemicals, which are also regulated at the global level, have been picked up as a priority chemicals by HBM4EU project, because this work will be continuously needed. Because as the EU and member states are parties to those multilateral environmental agreements, they will have to continuously provide information on those chemicals and their levels and their trends, because it's their obligation from the international law and also from the EU legislation. And so we hope that the future of the human biomonitoring will continue to provide us with the tools and will provide us with responses and in particular data. Because yes, there are probably already, and the HBM4EU project is working on having SOPs, methods, methodologies, techniques, and harmonized tools for us to be able to continue over the long term, which is great. But we must not, set ourselves in the box and be able to adapt. And I think I will come back to later.
Yeah, thank you very much. That would have been my question, how you see this more global aspect or the outreach to other countries. Thank you very much. I would now invite Hans Verhagen, who is now in the row of the speakers, the first representative of a European institution, a European agency. Please.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and also grateful that I'm allowed to be on stage and tell something about EFSA, because EFSA is the institute where I'm working for, the European Food Safety Authority, and we are tasked by the Commission and the Member States to do risk assessment in food and feed, and then advise Brussels and the Member States, who can then take measures, make laws, and the kind of. To that end, in EFSA we produce many a scientific opinion report, technical report. Sometimes we provide data sets, etc., that inform their managerial decisions. And as such, I'm very happy that EFSA is invited to this project, this gigantic project, because I'm a nutritionist by background. I'm also a toxicologist by background, and I think that food constitutes a major contribution to exposure. Let's say on a daily basis, we all consume maybe 1 kilogram of chemicals a day. That's a lot. And I know that not every chemical is toxic, etc., depending on the dose, of course. That's the classic paradigm that we have. But it is a lot, so I think food is a major determinant of public health. So, as such, I asked around in Parliament, because that's where we are based, what has EFSA already done on using human biomonitoring data to inform their risk assessments. Now, most of them are in the area of contaminants, not so much in the area of regulated products. There are some exceptions, but mostly are in the area of contaminants, and then we end with the heavy metals, the lead and arsenic and cadmium and mercury, the typical series. Contaminants, mycotoxins, DON we did use, phthalates, bisphenol A, the compound that knocks around every time and again. For pesticides, we have been using biomonitoring data for consumers as well as for operators. That's a bit tailored to the pesticides area. Also from a nutritionist perspective, the dietary reference value settings has been using human biomonitoring data or internal exposure data quite often in order to set appropriate levels of human intake. And Last but not least, I work personally a lot on the scientific substantiation of health claims, and without going into too much details, but heavy health claims, Article 14, require that if there is a health claim associated with a food or food ingredient, that there is a serious reduction in a risk factor, which, if you translate that, means biomarker. It's a biomarker of effect in that respect, whereas most biomarkers are in the area of exposure. But when we inventorize, we have been using, and we will use also in future, biomarkers quite often to inform our risk assessments. So, some requirements that I think are very important when we are using biomarkers are actually fourfold. On the one hand, I think it's important that the biomarker is validated, not only from an analytical perspective. Yes, of course, you must be able to control your experiments, to do your proficiency testing, to do your contingencies, your Z-scores, etc. That's a given. But also take care that your biomarker of interest is physiologically validated. Measure the right biomarker in the right medium at the right time. Otherwise, you may be looking outside of the wrong window, and then a biomarker may not be useful. At first, outcome pathways may be very instrumental now and also in future to identify the right measurement in the right place and the right time. And when then using biomarkers, I think that a study design should be as much as possible fit for purpose. So not just measuring the data because we just have samples of blood and urine by the lot available and see what we can measure. Now take care that there is a question to be answered rather than providing a lot of answers and I think, oh yeah, what could be the question? It's the other way around. It may sound, say, basic scientific designers, but it is very important. So pay attention to it. And also, when going into that direction, go for a sound design of the analysis plan. What is it really that I want to measure? And then go for it, go for the right biomarkers, the right instruments, etc., and then inform the risk assessment. And about informing the risk assessment, I can come back in the second part of my answer. So at this time, I think that would be enough from the FR perspective. It is important, it will be important, and I think we will be certainly inclined to use it more and more in the future, provided that the data are good and reliable and can inform our risk assessment.
Thank you very much for that. Björn Hansen, may I invite you to, as the second speaker from a European institution, agency, and maybe also giving us your thoughts on what would be a framework for this future coordinated activity, as all of the activities should be well coordinated and are important, as we have learned in our quick survey.
I'll try my best, and thank you very much. And also, let's say, repeat my thanks for being here and having this opportunity to have this discussion. Couple of words on ICA, and then I'll talk about sustainability from our perspective, what that means, sustainability in terms of tasks and doing work, and then what ICA sees in this project now and in the future. Basically, ICA, in my words, is the workhorse on chemicals legislation. We house a few pieces of legislation, but we service almost all chemicals legislation. There are 5 pieces of legislation that generate information. It's the pesticides regulation, which is done by EFSA. It's the medicines or pharmaceuticals and veterinary medicines legislation, which is done by EMA. And it's REACH and biocides done for, well, REACH for, or biocides for biocides and REACH for everything else. And what I mean with workhorse is that we collect data, we generate data, what I should say is we collect the data that industry gives us and spends a lot of time putting into IT systems to allow that. We tell the industry which data they should generate, and they go out and do it and submit it to us. We do the hazard assessment of the data that comes in, and this is where fundamentally we're feeding into all other pieces of chemicals legislation. It be food contact materials, it be toys, it be cosmetics, it be whatever, because they always rely on the data that comes from REACH, and they rely on the classification and hazard assessment done under classification and labeling and REACH. Then whenever we think that there's a problem, and here we collectively in the union, then we go ahead also and look at risk management, or risk assessment and then risk management, and maybe a bit unique in terms of an EU agency. We also do the technical assessment on risk management, determining what is the best risk management measure to identify to address an identified risk, and we calculate and look into the social and economic consequences of non-action and of implementing the best risk management measure, all scientifically, technically, and objective, and then presenting that package to the policymakers. Now, in terms of human biomonitoring data, yes, we use it if it's there, and we'd love to use more of it. Basically, the risk assessment framework that is implemented in our legislation, in a nutshell, is figure out what the hazard are based on the best information you got, figure out what the exposure is based on the best information you got, compare the two. If you think there's a problem, go out and find the best way to address it and determine what the consequences are of addressing them. And in that framework, human biomonitoring fits beautifully, like all other data. That is unconventional, meaning it's not an OECD guideline or something like that. And we've used human biomonitoring for risk assessment at EU level. I remember in the end of the 90s, we used it for a number of the existing substances regulations, all the way up to the phthalate combined risk assessment of several phthalates restriction, which has just been adopted and gone through, where we actually used the predecessor of this program, the data coming from that in order to inform our risk assessment and the risk management. Sustainability in this framework, from my perspective, we're just the workhorse. We're generating the information in order for the policymakers to make what we consider, well, an informed decision. We need to get a task if we're to be involved in this. The sustainable way to get a task is through a regulation and no other way, because if we're asked to do something and that something is not legally binding, then it's not sustainable. Then we can decide not to do it 2 years later. So it's a regulation. To do a task, you need human resources and you need money. That's all an issue of budget. We get our budget from two places: fees from industry and a subsidy. The way you get those two determined is the subsidy is through a regulation. So that goes nicely hand in hand with the task, because attached to a regulation is a financial fiche that says, ICA, do this, and you get 2 people, and you get 100,000, 150,000 to do that, and then it's programmed beyond an MFF. So it's beyond the 7 years. It's programmed as a default unless policy decides that we should not do this anymore. And then there's the fees. And the way fees are done, I mean, that's not us. That's the Commission which decides. But what does that mean? It means the Commission proposes and the member state decides. So for that whole machinery to work, we need political support. So basically, those are the 3 things. We need a regulation. We need the Commission to make a proposal regarding fees, and we need fully political support, because otherwise the fee proposal will not be adopted by the Commission, or the subsidy will not be given to us. Now, what can we do within this program? Well, our main interest is to inform the program on which chemicals we're interested in, and to use the data that comes out of it. And as my colleague from EFSA, the data as good as possible. But it is as good as possible. I mean, if you do something and it's not great, we, in our risk assessment framework dictated by the regulation, which says do the best you can, we can still use it. So even if something goes wrong en route, we can still use the data. We might not be able to use it as forcefully as otherwise, but we can use it. And therefore, even what you're doing now, if you consider this, oh, it's not all completely harmonized methodology, repeating and everything, the information is still very valuable. And the quicker we get it, the more we can use it, even though it's not completely calibrated. It's, of course, better, again, when it gets calibrated later on. So give us the data in real time. give us the data on chemicals which we're looking at, or that we will look at in the future, and we'll help you on the latter. Keep specimens in a specimen bank so that one can do an ex post analysis to get trend analysis if we need it. That would be extremely useful. And it would be even more useful if we could ask for it, which is best done in a regulation. If the data can be collected with some sort of background information regarding exposure or behavioral or just GPS or GIS or whatever it's called, coordinates, so that we can correlate it with the other data in IPChem, so that one gets an idea this is maybe a high exposure region which leads to high exposure in blood, or this is a high exposure region where for some reason people don't get it into their blood. That would be very helpful. And the more of that type of data, and I fully realize how difficult that is. I've done a lot of statistics in my young days on cadmium in blood and in hair and on all sorts of other things, and I know how difficult it is. But even, and here again, any information is helpful, even if it's not great information from a scientific perspective. Because the way we do risk assessment is we do try to make the best informed decision, but we don't try to make the best decision. Well, we try to, but we never can. So I would say that that's what we like out of this program. And what I that was the one thing I couldn't read in my notes that I'd scribbled down here, even with my glasses. I should say we do have a competence. I mean, in terms of what we want out of the program, it's the data. But we also have a competence in databases. And it's very handy to have the database and the competence to manage the database and to use the data in the same place, because then the people who use the data can tell the people who manage and develop the database what they need, and that can be transferred out there. And the more databases we have that can talk to each other, the better. And again, the more physically those people who develop those databases are closer to each other, the quicker these things go together. So a plea to at least try to reflect on putting these databases in some of the agencies or national partners, but in a way that it gains synergies with the rest of the work being done. So I hope that was not more than my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Well, it was more, but in
I
fact,
know, sorry.
I have a short question and would like to have an even shorter answer. The question is, did I understand correctly that you could imagine that there is a kind of mandatory HBM according to ECHA's needs?
I mean, yes.
Super, thank you.
And if I can just exemplify, today we can request HBM data on a substance if there's a concern in a part of REACH that's called substance evaluation. Now, that's of course not the tool to go out and do this more broadly. But having representative data, so this going down the route of science, I think we all here in this room who do want to do the work and can do the work know that if there's an obligation behind doing it, it's easier to get the time, resources, etc. to do it. That's exactly, for me, my management board tells me, do you have to do this? I say, well, it would be really fun to do it, but no. And then they say, okay, don't do it. So, and I guess it's the same around the table.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hans Weinings.
With all these anti-androgen chemicals, I thought you were going to start with me when you were starting with the ladies, but it's okay, I'll do it. Okay, I will not give a lengthy introduction to the agency. I think you know the agency. We're a partner of this HBM for EU. I'm also not a toxicologist or a biologist or a chemist, so I'm a scientist in governance and policy. Yeah? So I will take more that perspective and look towards the future to say something else than everybody else. For me, the real issue here is how does human biomonitoring can it be embedded as a key, a critical, or even an indispensable component of what you could call a solid knowledge base to address the issue of concerns of chemicals, environment, and health. Yeah? And when I say a knowledge base, that's a term that we use in the agency. A knowledge base has several components, and I think it's important to look at the chemicals area as a domain where there are indeed several building blocks of that knowledge base. Yeah? You've got what is done in EFSA, you've got what is done in ECHA, there is a scientific part of the knowledge base, there is our knowledge base. So this can be an additional, and I think over time, an indispensable component of that knowledge base. A knowledge base in our language means that you start from M, monitoring, human biomonitoring. It's rather obvious what is meant by that here. Then you create data, yeah, and that is a difficult task, creating quality checked, quality assured, stable European level data. You discussed this today in a variety of issues. Then you want to create indicators, information, integration, yeah, which is a specific task, because the data usually do not speak for themselves. We hear that all the time. Just give us the data, they speak for themselves. That is utter nonsense. Yeah? They need a framing, they need to be framed in a policy setting, they need interpretation, they have a history. I mean, there's all sorts of issues. So that is a task in and of itself. And then you need an assessment logic where you look at what you have in a domain and you need to use your intelligence to then link it to policies, and then of course you need to keep that in a knowledge setting. I think human biomonitoring, in order to play a role there, has to be comparable, shared, accessible and transparent, and needs to build time series. Yeah? That is indispensable, otherwise you cannot be part of a credible knowledge base. I think in this stage, the research project, in my understanding, does several things. First of all, it establishes a European dynamic, yeah, which is important. Secondly, it jumpstarts a number of the countries. There are countries like Germany, and I know Flanders, Belgium has done this for a longer time. You jumpstart the others through this project, limiting transaction costs and building up and all of that. You streamline and harmonize. Yeah? And you start to deliver data that is valuable and shared data. I think in a second stage, the key term is embedding, an embedded governance approach. I don't think, and this is a personal opinion, that's not been through our management board, or I think that this human biomonitoring for EU will not survive as a mega research project. Yeah. It needs to be embedded. There is a research component to it, but if you want to be part of a knowledge base over time, there are other elements as well. And then a mega research project is not going to be enough. So here's my critical minimum elements of that governance approach for me would be indeed looking at a potential regulation, yeah, and what are the merits of that. That regulation can, and I think should, have a governance approach as an integral part of it, and there are many examples in Europe where that is the case. The Energy Union is a big example in another domain, climate and energy. I think it needs to have a clear vision on how the EU level relates to the member states, and in this case the member countries, because it goes well beyond the EU. It should have a clear vision on how you connect science to policy, it should have financial resources as part of it. I think it should also have a management of information component in it, and IPChem is not an institution. You know, I'm sorry to say so, so it will need to be embedded in a much more fundamental way. I think it will need an institutional anchor, and there are some agencies in Europe, for example, that have as their core business bringing knowledge to policy, so maybe the agencies could play a role in that sense, not as individuals, but banking on their 25 years in our case, or less years of experience in doing this type of work. And I think it should also have a governance vision on stakeholders. Yeah? And if you can bring these things to the table, I think you have a good chance of indeed further establishing human biomonitoring as a critical and component of this chemicals knowledge base that will allow you then to make better analyses, better assessments, that can lead to better policies at the various levels. I hope I didn't step on any toes by saying that I don't believe that mega research projects in and of themselves, without this strong institutional anchoring and governance vision, that they are not the future. I've been on the science side until 5 years ago. I was a professor and I did research stuff and I was leading a research institution. The idea that science somehow flows to policies without a strong intermediate sort of embedding, I think is not correct. So I will leave it at that in the interest of time. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, in the environment area, at least, there is quite a number of directives and regulations that prescribe to member states to do monitoring and reporting on very different aspects. Could you imagine which of these pieces of legislation could give an example? I mean, you mentioned the energy community and the energy climate governance.
The Water Framework Directive, Air Quality Directive. I mean, there are a bunch of directives that actually require member states to measure things in a uniform way, with deadlines, with all of that. So if this project can establish the capacity in Europe to start doing that and has a link with policies, I think there is quite a bit out there that can serve as a regulatory basis or example to work with.
Yeah. At the agency, you make very strong use of EIONet and topic centers. Can you say some sentences on that? And do you think that could serve as a model?
Well, we use a triangle sort of approach. You need content, science, policy, content. You need a network that is functional and that is governed. It's usually not self-governing over a long time. That needs a governance approach. And then you need infrastructure. And I think in this case, the infrastructure is the IT and knowledge sharing, but also the laboratory infrastructure. If you work in that triangle, I think that's the type MDIAK, monitoring data indicators, assessment knowledge, and then this sort of triangle approach. That's the basis of how we approach knowledge work in a knowledge base European setting. And I think I'm not saying it's the panacea, but at least we can base some of the approach on experience that is built up. And the same can be said for the other agencies, I think, where there is a history of working with that type of approach. Not monopolizing the governance, not monopolizing the science side, not monopolizing anything, but being the facilitator in bringing top knowledge to policy processes. That's our core business.
Thank you very much. May I ask, does someone at the panel want to react to anything someone else has said so far? Always with this view, how do we want to see the future? What shall be the framing and what makes HBM sustainable? Yes, Björn, please.
It's a very short remark now. I didn't use much time. It's simply to say that I think my observation is each of us approached it from different angles, which is super, but I at least saw nothing that, hardly anything, at least in the bigger picture, that anybody said that I would say anything against. Yeah. So I mean, for me, I sat here nodding all the time.
Katharina.
Yeah, I think that very much support what was just said from the Environmental Agency, because yes, I think that without the cornerstones that you first have to have the knowledge, you have to have the infrastructure, you have to be able to adapt to the progress, and by creating content, then you may have something which is durable. So yes, these I think are really indispensable components. But we also must not forget that you need an ownership. And that ownership is not only a regulatory anchor, if you want to call it from the perspective of an agency, but if you want to call it from a perspective of a member state, then you also need, a government support. And I think that in case of the human biomonitoring, this is also something which is quite sensitive because it's member states, it's the citizens, it's also policymakers, depends on their voters, etc., etc. There are a lot of things which come into play, but I think there has to be, be it either way, whatever model or option is then selected, or combination of models, I think that there has to be a strong involvement of member states, because as you rightly said, the current model and components that are in the HBM for EU project do go beyond EU. What is there available? What is in the scope? And I would like to repeat once again that it is not just EU. We are not ourselves the world. The world is also out there, and we have to be able to grasp what is outside and react and adapt and take the good ones, but also if we are at the lead, then maybe serve as example. But if there are good examples outside, then we probably do not need to reinvent them, but just adopt them and try to capitalize on synergies. So those are two messages I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Still, I think we have to find a structure that works for our purposes. Thank you very much. I take three short interventions from the panel, and then I would like to look at the questions posed by our audience. Robert, Professor Baruch.
Yeah, I just want to comment, I don't see any contradiction between having an anchor that would more or less be in charge of the more sustainable data generation, human biomonitoring data generation, and coupled to research activities, in a way that is maybe synergistic and that would have both of them. I don't see any contradiction with that. I think we should probably work on that kind of thinking, but I understand what you mean, but I think we can all, if you want to actually use as much as possible what HBM4U has been doing, I think coupling both approaches would be a very fruitful way to go on.
Thank you very much. Lilian Buse?
I just want to support what you said about that we won't be successful with a large research or mega research project. I totally agree, but I think that this HBM4U is not only a mega research project, it has many different parts already. We heard that in the last session that we have this strong science to policy work already, we have the strong communications work, the stakeholder work, so I think HBM4U is much more than the mega research project, and that we are all sitting here already thinking about the future, right? Which is like 3 years in the future, I think already shows that they are already thinking ahead.
Thank you very much. Anne?
Yes, I would like to add something about the link between research and assessment that was alluded to by Robert just before. I think in France, our agency ANSES is combining both research and assessment. And I think this is of great value because you need to uptake all the results of research and the technological developments as soon as possible. And I think having people in the same place involved both in research and in assessment is really an asset that we should not forget about.
Yes, a very short addition to that. I like what the other Hans said, making it embedded into a wider structure. I fully agree to that, and I think also for the future of the Human Biomonitoring Initiative, it should not be a standalone. It should have its links with any other entities like EFSA, like ECHA, like EEA, and so on and so on. And as such, I think it is prudent to consider, and we discussed it also yesterday, so you may know what I'm going to say. Be very careful of trying to identify your own health-based guidance values, because that's the task we have, at least in EFSA and also in my colleague institutes. Do not make your own, because there's a dual risk. On the one hand, it's a duplication of effort, so it's money and time and resources lost. The more severe downside is that there may be different outcomes, divergent views, and at least in the food area we have an official regulation that if there are divergent views they should be discussed, resolved, etc., and maybe not with the HBM for EU project because you're not an institute, so we cannot disagree with you like we can disagree with national entities, but collaborate with us in order to get the one view out. And as such, I'm also very happy that during today and earlier on the week we already made appointments or agreements to discuss some of the work packages that are of relevance to EFSA. And I think that's the way forward.
Yes, which makes an argument for a more formal structure in my ears at least.
I don't know if it needs to be formal, but at least it needs to be identified.
Yes. Short.
Yes, extremely short. I did not suggest that I don't think that research money can play a role in human biomonitoring, but I don't think that an embedded future can be based on Horizon Europe money alone. Yeah, so I think that is a critical element, and I think you will come to a sort of standardization of things. And at the same time, on the science side, you will keep developing new science. We had this brilliant presentation on the mixtures. Yeah, that made it very clear where there is a lot of potential. But also on the policy side, you will see developments. So I think that go-between needs to be properly organized in order to make the research money and the policy connection in a stronger way. So that's fine with me.
Yes, very good. Thank you very much. I come to the first and highest ranked question, and I think it goes straight to Björn. Obviously also to the others if they want. How to harmonize risk assessment results with HBM between different chemical frameworks? That is what we learned, that there are different chemical frameworks, REACH, biocides, pesticides, and so. This needs a compromise and good communication.
How to harmonize risk assessment. I mean, risk assessment has two components, generically, right? I mean,
how to harmonize risk assessment with HBM.
Yeah, but that question you can answer if you look at risk. When we perform a risk assessment, there are two components. There's risk assessment methodology, and then there's applying the methodology to the individual chemicals. And I would dare say that the largest scientific, technical competence is in the latter. The guidance gives you some ideas. And therefore, the consistency doesn't lay in the actual guidance documents. The consistency lays in the experts' experience in applying the guidance documents to the individual case and what they know and their gut feelings and how they discuss. So applying human biomonitoring is not, it is of course in a consistent way in risk assessment. It's an issue of creating the right framework. My belief is the guidance documents we got right now do that because they already include human biomonitoring as an input. Our regulation even says that if you have such data and it's of good quality, it has preference over exposure modeling. It's much more an issue of building up the human capacity in the expert groups to do this consistently across a lot of substances. Best way to do that is you guys generate a lot of data, we use a lot of data, and it gets discussed by the same group of experts. It's not exactly the answer maybe that people wanted, but this is really my gut experience. It lays in the individual application because a risk assessment is always, there's always something special on the chemical.
Okay, thank you very much. Go to the next question, which says, the HBM for EU guidance values need to be transparently explained and subject to regulatory scrutiny, which goes, again, I think into this direction. Can we make the results more formal?
Yeah, I suppose that the question was posted before I provided the answer. I would be careful on that. Let's say the information is coming from institutes like EFSA and probably my colleague institutes, and then the information will go with scientific advice to Brussels or to the member states in order to have the most appropriate of guidance values. So I would be careful.
Yeah.
There's a balancing act to be got, and I'm definitely on the cautious side because it could be misunderstood. And a starting point is what you call these values within this project. You might leave out the EU, you might say, call it something different. I fully agree that if we had the capacities with the mandate and the resources, and I've explained how that works, to go out and actually set these values, then that would be the ideal world. Now, we're not there, but I would be very, very careful, in particular in how this is communicated. And why I say it's a balancing act is, of course, if you come up with results that show that there's 137 chemicals in every single citizen around Europe, and you're not relating that to anything, then that could give a worry that, oops, you know, we're all at risk, we'll all die in 20 years or something, where it is putting that value in a relation to something else that enables a more qualitative statement. Or qualifying the data itself. So cautious, but I do understand the necessity of not being scaremongering by leaving it out and just saying, look, here's all these chemicals everywhere, and wait until policy reacts on it. So I understand there's an issue, but please also with care.
Does someone from the project consortium want to come in on that?
Well, we had quite a long discussion about that at the governing board of HBM for EU, and I think maybe it's difficult for you to put it into context. So in HBM for EU, we develop such a set of health-based guidance values on the basis of a concept which includes the GDIs as derived by EFSA in a very transparent way. And mainly our French colleagues from ANSYS and UBA develop the first draft. They are then sent out to the national hubs of each partner country, where all scientists of this country, which are felt to be important from the perspective of the key players in this country, can contribute to these recommendations, proposals. Then the feedback is integrated, and after revision, a value is being derived. So in HBM for EU, we think it's extremely necessary to have such kind of interpretation, because people donate their samples, and we say, well, we have 3 milligrams of DINCH in your blood or in your urine, and they will ask, what does it mean? And we need to give them some information. And so the current program as existing is a very transparent and inclusive way to approach the issue. Of course, we are very happy to get also input from the agencies, but there are guidance values, not limit values, because you cannot do a limit value for internal exposure. And so I was pretty astonished how interesting this issue, this instrument, which is already established in Germany for more than 20 years, had raised in our discussions. But I think for the HBM for EU consortium is always a great news if important agencies from the European level are interested in what we are doing, and if they feed in also their input at this current stage where we are more or less the mega research program.
Thank you very much, Marieke Kolosa-Gering, for that. I don't know, I don't think we should go into depth with this discussion, but I thought it was important, as there is interest on this issue, to get this answer. So, well, the next question really addresses the main issue of our session. It reads, how will the sustainability of HBM for Europe be ensured after 2021, and where next? Anyone inspired?
I think you can capture it in one sentence. Human biomonitoring has to be recognized as a solid method that is integrated in the knowledge base at the European level about chemicals, health, and the environment. And that is the sustainability of human biomonitoring. If you do not enter into a sort of regular knowledge base, it will remain a side issue. If it's not solid in all of its components, it will never enter that knowledge base. So I think those are the two key components for me.
Can we make the first sentence the name of the next work package in the project? So, next question, how can HBM4EU contribute to the development of the non-toxic environment strategy? Who wants to address that?
I think
European
I
Commission.
may, sorry, maybe no one wants to say from the institutions, but I think that what on one hand is a task of the HBM4EU project currently is to provide harmonization, to build capacities in countries which probably have not yet been to the highest standards that is available in the EU, and generate data. And so how HBM4EU contributes, it can actually contribute by solidifying the already good tools which are there and saying these are solid tools, these are the tools which should continue, and they are necessary so that we have sustainable and durable human biomonitoring. And HBM4EU can be definitely used for identifying these tools and strengthening where possible.
Yeah, so well, we come to the end of this session anyhow. So there are two options. Either we take, if there are urgent questions or remarks, we take these from the audience, or we have 1 minute each for each panelist, if you like, and close the session. Yes, please.
Sorry, I have a question which is about the scope, because at the moment we're working on quite a range of substances, some of the more legacy substances, also emerging and mixtures. I'd like to ask what you think the scope of a future initiative should be. Should it be more focused on, for example, supporting evaluation under REACH? And if we were to have a regulation, how would we have a regulation that reached across legislative silos? Dietary exposure, industrial chemicals, environmental exposure. Thank you.
So we integrate this in our final round. Please, short statements.
Okay. I'll take less than 1 minute. I would, to answer the question on screen, I would not talk about a non-toxic environment strategy. I would talk about a safe environmental strategy. Not everything is toxic at every level. If at some point in time it's at a safe level, I would say, okay, communicate and then continue until the next one. Don't bother about something that is sufficiently low / safe. Focus on something else.
Katharina?
To me, I think the scope, I think it should mirror the priorities, and that is in sense to be able to react to the new challenges that arise, because we don't know yet, we don't have crystal ball. And secondly, you know, the priority chemicals as they are different because there are legacy chemicals, but they are not yet solved. There are chemicals that are dealt with at the global level. So I think it should remain versatile, but not that we would do care of everything. I think there is a parallel that reminded me, and that is emerging policy issues from strategic approach to international chemicals management that exists at the global level, and that actually is an avenue that allows the global community to react to things which are not yet globally regulated. So I don't know whether HBM should supply this role, but I see some parallel in that.
Thank you very much. Anne?
Yes, I think that we should think of the future in building the next generation HBM4EU. And for me, there were two things that I heard during these 2 days I was here, was that there are really new approaches developing on mixtures, and there is all the aspects of emerging substances that needs to be developed. And I think we should find a way to address this, and this is what a combined audience between agencies and researchers should be able to do in the future. So we should keep this in mind. Just go.
I'll go a little bit back to basics in terms of what we use the information for, not saying that this bit of how do we further develop our risk assessment methodology, our risk management methodology to ensure that it takes into account mixtures, etc. That was my question before, and I think it's very important. But I see that as an issue which goes much further than this project alone. There's much more going on there, but it needs to be resolved, and there can be something coming from this project that helps that discussion. Back to basics. Let's assume in the future we got a project which is sustainable, which delivers high quality data with a time series fulfilling Hans's requirements. Then there are three types of chemicals. There's legacy, there's what we currently are regulating, and what we want to regulate in the future. Given the fact that there's a time lag always between what we want to, once we see we got to regulate something, there is always a time pressure to regulate it. We got 12 months. You can't do so much when we tell you, can you do some human biomonitoring with a 10-year timeline on a substance that we're going to regulate in 10 months? Not going to work. So there's definitely a focus from my perspective. Legacy is great to monitor because it shows effectiveness of measures. But so there's something there, but it's the third part. How do we develop a system that can better be used also as a priority-setting vehicle for which chemicals we should look at in more detail that we haven't regulated or that we're in the middle of the machinery of regulating?
I agree to the previous speakers, but I want to add to that we need this human biomonitoring knowledge base, like you said, but we should definitely also use it for evaluate the regulations we have done. And so we can use this as a very good example to move forward how we should regulate in the future. So one major part I see in this human biomonitoring is evaluation of our regulations and then see how what do we need to do to adapt this.
I agree with everything, and so I'll take a completely different angle, okay? I think Europe is going through a crisis of confidence in the European project, yeah? This type of collaboration, this is Europe at work. We do more together with 28 countries, and all those countries that want to collaborate. It's not by coincidence that Norway and Iceland are here, huh? We do more together in a binding way with all of these countries than any other set of 2 countries do even for 10% on the planet. The exchange between the US and Canada on environmental information is laughable compared to what we do. So we should take some confidence in the fact that this continent, even if it takes time, there are bumps in the road. This project had a long time before it was all settled and a bump in the road. Yes, and it's complex, but this is what Europe is all about. And I would say, let's radiate that outside, yes? That is what we need. People are doubting the European project. Get out of here, you know. Where would we be with human biomonitoring in 5 years if we would not have this type of European engagement? Yeah, in most countries, we know where we would be, hardly anywhere. Yeah? Would we be able to integrate this in a European knowledge base? Not a snowball's chance in hell, right? None. So that is the type of stuff that Europe stands for on the day-to-day basis. And of course, there are the big ideas, but that's what this project should also radiate externally. And whether that's a priority substance or not, I have no idea, but that's where I wanted to end. Yeah.
Well, I guess I will take this immediately to President Macron and tell him, you know, that this is where the effort should be to build, you know, a euro. And thank you. I mean, as a part of the consortium, I think we can only be extremely satisfied by what we have heard here from, you know, all the interest and coming, you know, from the EU and member state in this, in the sustainability of our HBM for you in this sustainability. And I think there are many suggestions. We have heard many suggestions, many useful suggestions. We will take those and we will try to work together to build this.
Absolutely. I thank you very much. I will not try to sum up. We have it all on record. There was a wealth of input and on suggestions and guidance. You have been an excellent panel. And thank you very much for coming to Vienna for this conference and for your input. Great. Thank you very much.